Hello all, and welcome to the first of only 2 lectures for today's topic, Roman sexuality. In this one, we'll just talk about Roman sexuality in general, and then move on to some representations of sexuality in literature. I want to note that this lecture contains some explicit content due to its topic, and also give a content warning of language and sexual assault. Let's begin. So Roman conceptions of sexuality are very different from what we have today. Roman men were free to pursue sexual relationships outside of marriage as long as it was not with a citizen man or woman. They had a goddess of sexual pleasure who was Venus. This means that they did not consider sex or sexual pleasure shameful, but it doesn't mean there weren't regulations on proper sexual behavior for both men and women, but especially women. Another very visible way in which the Romans differed from mainstream American culture is that elite Roman houses might display graphic sexual scenes or phalluses as art or good luck charms. And then finally, another big difference is that the Romans had very different categories and concepts of sexual orientation and identity than we do, and I'll say more about that in a minute. And this guy, Priapus, was the Roman god of fertility and always distinguished by his very large phallus. He's an example of the sort of art which could decorate a fancy house. This painting is from the entryway of the house of the Vetii in Pompeii. So there are some limitations on our evidence about Roman sexuality. First of all, artistic does not always mean literal. There was an absence of theorizing about sexuality in the Roman world. Instead, we piece together attitudes about sexuality from literature, political and historical texts, legal texts, and art. Every literary genre had a different set of rules about displaying sexual material, a different set of attitudes toward it. And not every literary text in particular is a good reflection of actual sexual practices or attitudes. Artistic representations of sexuality are also not always literal representations of what the Romans actually did, particularly if the point of the art was to be titillating or pornographic. But even determining what ancient art is pornographic is especially hard because we don't know the context. Another problem with our evidence is that a lot of it has actually been destroyed. Early excavators not only did hasty excavations in search of art, but also destroyed a lot of the erotic art because it offended their 18th and 19th century sensibilities. This was especially true of things found in Pompeii, which was full of explicit material. In fact, our entire second lecture will be devoted to Pompeii. The things that weren't destroyed were hidden in a secret room in museums, only accessible by educated men. The secret room in the Naples Museum only opened to the public in 2009. But material culture objects aren't the only erotic things from the ancient world that were manipulated or destroyed in some way. A lot of the literature from Rome that contained sexually explicit material was censored, both in the original Latin, by not translating the lines or leaving out whole poems. There are also still some commentaries on Catullus, who you will read a lot of for today, that in print that exclude poems with obscenities. In fact, a lot of these immoral and unpleasant things, both material and literature, were ignored until the 1970s. And so before we begin, let's talk about some terminology. These are terms that we use today to talk about sexuality, and we're going to see how our own terms and concepts differ from the Romans. So in English, we have the word sex, which has 2 meanings. It's the difference based on genitals and a sexual act. Latin also had a word, sexus, that sounds like sex, but actually means gender. And it had way too many different words for sexual acts to even list them all here. We in English have a term, sexuality. This term refers to a lot of things: sexual knowledge, beliefs, attitudes, values, and behaviors of individuals. This can include the study of anatomy, sexual identity and orientation, as well as feelings and relationships. How we express our sexuality can be influenced by ethical, spiritual, and cultural concerns. The Romans had no word that corresponds to this, nor did they theorize about sexuality the way we do today. That doesn't mean that the sexual behaviors have not been used to inform the theory of sexuality. In fact, they helped form it. It also doesn't mean that there aren't theoretical debates about sexuality in ancient Rome today. So let's look at two of the main theories of sexuality in the history of sexuality. And there is an ongoing scholarly debate about whether sexuality itself is a concept rooted in biology and thus unchanging over time and place and culture, or whether it is instead a social construction subject to change over time and place. The former view is called essentialism, and it is the belief that people have properties that are essential to what they are, and these properties are inborn and existed before acculturation. Where sexuality is concerned, essentialists believe that a person has a sexual orientation produced purely by biology, and that the labels we give to these sexual orientations, whether homosexual, bisexual, or heterosexual, to use modern labels, are unchanging categories that apply to all cultures over time. This is in comparison to constructionism, which is the theory that there are different sexual categories in different times and places because these sexual categories are determined by culture, not biology. So for constructionists, everything about sexuality is relative and formed by culture. Sexuality and gender roles are learned roles and not inherent. A constructionist would argue that homosexual behavior or activity is universal, that a homosexual identity, as it is defined in modern Western culture, for example, is culturally and historically specific. Essentialism versus constructionism is different from two other modern debates about sexuality. The debates about the causes of sexuality. The nature versus nurture debate is over whether or not sexuality is due to genetics or upbringing, while determinism versus voluntarism is over whether or not sexual identity can be changed. They're both concerned with how one forms their sexual identity. In comparison, essentialism versus constructionism is much deeper and more abstract. It is concerned with how sexual categories are formed throughout history. This is all very complicated, and I don't expect you all to become experts in the theory of sexuality, but you have to have this background to understand where classicists are coming from when they talk about Roman sexuality. So now let's move on to sexual behavior and categories in Rome. Most discussions of sexuality in Rome are constructionist in nature because the sexual categories we have today, heterosexuality, homosexuality, and bisexuality, do not map onto the sexual categories of ancient Rome. In fact, the Romans did not assign people identities based on their sexual preferences, so there aren't even words for heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual. This doesn't mean there weren't culturally accepted / default sexual behavior for men and women. Men were expected to be attracted to both beautiful women and adolescent boys. In fact, there was no stigma attached to sexual attraction between two males as long as there were certain rules followed. Roman culture cared a lot about whether a man was the penetrator or the penetrated in a sexual relationship. The penetrator or active partner was considered manly and dominant, while the penetrated or passive partner was seen as emasculated and on par with women and slaves in Roman. Thus, the default culturally accepted sexual behavior for men was to be an impenetrable penetrator. Romans didn't actually talk about the sexual behavior of women much due to the phallocentrism of their culture. We'll talk more about phallocentrism in a minute. For now, it's best to say that Romans expected women to be univira, a one-man woman. That is, they should only ever have sex with their husbands. As women were penetrated in the sexual encounter, they were inherently subservient to their husbands. These ideas about female sexuality are based on the Roman idea that normal sexual behavior always involved the phallus. A man penetrated men and women, and it was unnatural for women to be the active partner in a sexual relationship because they could not penetrate. Thus, they gave very little thought to sexual relationships between women, what we would call lesbianism. With very few exceptions, it is not written about or presented visually, and when it is, it had to involve a dildo, because there was no way it could be sexual if it didn't involve a phallic symbol and penetration of some sort. I've already mentioned that the Romans considered it normal for men to be attracted to beautiful male adolescents, and that male citizens were allowed to have sexual relationships with slave boys or young male freedmen. But there were certain rules that men had to follow for these activities to be socially accepted. Two male freeborn citizens could not have a sexual relationship with one another, meaning that men were restricted to only having sexual relationships with male slaves or freedmen. First of all, the ideal male partner for a Roman male citizen was a young, hairless, as in having no beard or body hair yet, boy who was not a free citizen, so not the son of a citizen male. This young boy would always have to take the passive role / be penetrated for this relationship to be socially acceptable. This is due to the fact that Romans thought it was so degrading for a citizen male to be in the passive penetrated role that if he did perform that duty to someone, the stigma of it would follow him around for the rest of his life. The existence of these rules for acceptable male-male sexual relationships means that there were also unacceptable male-male sexual relationships. The worst thing a citizen male could do was submit to being penetrated, even if their partner were a freedman or a slave. But just because this was the ideal doesn't mean that it didn't happen. Literature is full of invective against men who are accused of liking to take the passive role in a male-male sexual relationship. And we don't just see this in graffiti or satire, but it is often used to degrade one's political opponent or rivals. Cicero, in his speeches against Mark Antony, accuses him of being married to another man, suggesting that he allowed himself to be penetrated by another man. Your book translates this as a poof. There was even a derogatory term for a man who preferred to take the passive role in a sexual relationship. These people were considered effeminate. They were depicted with curly hair, using perfume, and having an effeminate walk, wearing colored clothing and an unbelted tunic, and they had the tendency to dance at parties. These men were thought to have abandoned their masculinity. This term was also used as a slur by people's enemies. Of course, the true duty of a Roman citizen was to produce a male heir with his wife. It was assumed he would focus his sexual energy on his wife rather than slave boys, but it's hard to say how frequently this ideal was the reality. In continuing our discussion of unacceptable male-male sexual encounters, it was absolutely unacceptable if a man gave oral sex to anyone, male or female. In fact, the Romans were obsessed with the purity of the mouth, and it could not be sullied with oral sex, which was considered filthy. That being said, it was okay for a man to receive oral sex because in that instance, he was still the active penetrating partner. But the giver of oral sex, whether male or female, was considered unclean and compromised. Due to this, oral sex was considered something that only a woman or a male slave or other low-class male person would engage with. But this woman, male slave, or other low-class male would still be looked down upon as having an unclean mouth. This taboo against oral sex is even depicted in erotic art. Very few scenes exist, and in them, it is usually a man who is performing it on a woman. As you can see in the example on your screen from the suburban baths in Pompeii, the male performing the oral sex is depicted as small and subservient to the woman. This woman is probably a high-class courtesan, so not a freeborn woman. Thus, you can see why many historians of Roman sexuality, myself included, are constructionists. The way we use the terms homosexual, bisexual, and heterosexual do not map onto Roman culture very well because it was assumed that every man had by default bisexual interests. This was his natural state. What really matters to them was not the gender of the person a man was attracted to, but whether the man was in the active role or passive role in the sexual relationship. But although Romans were definitely focused on male sexuality in the phallus, they did talk about female sexuality, usually negatively. As I mentioned before, women were expected to be univira, a one-man woman, and thus only have sex in the context of marriage. This was very unlike their husbands. Despite this, women were often depicted as being unable to control their sexual urges and always at risk of engaging in an adulterous affair. We saw this in some of the negative depictions of women from Thursday. So with that as our background, let's move on to talking about some literature that talks about sex in Rome. Before we move on to talking about the erotic poetry I had you read for this lesson, I want to talk about some Latin words for sexual acts and how your Oxford Anthology translates them. Most of these poems don't seem as dirty as they are due to the way that your textbook translated them. We already saw this with the term conitis. Your book translated as poofer, but it really means effeminate man or girly man. Futuere is a verb that your book translates as to have sex with, but is really synonymous with our word fuck. Related are irumare, which your book translates as stuff your gob, but really means face fuck, but with the sense of forcing your penis down someone's mouth. And finally, there's pedicare, which your book translates as bugger, but really means butt fuck. Note how all of these, just like Roman ideas about sexuality, are all phallocentric. Roman love elegy invites us to identify with a passionately enamored speaker whose subjective experiences seem the same as our own because they are depicted with considerable psychological acumen. And therefore, this is where we get a lot of our sexually explicit content. Usually these poems are dedicated to one girlfriend. Girlfriend is in quotes for a few reasons. First of all, most of these women were actually probably high-class courtesans whom the men paid for a relationship. Catullus' poems are about his tumultuous love affair with a woman named Lesbia. Propertius writes about his girlfriend Cynthia, and Corinna is Ovid's girlfriend. However, of these girlfriends, only one can be traced back to a historical figure. Catullus uses Lesbia as a pseudonym for a woman named Clodia, who was not actually a high-class prostitute, but an elite woman who was the sister of Catullus' enemy. Even in the ancient world, there was speculation about who Cynthia and Corinna were based on, but no definitive answers have come about. This has led some scholars to speculate that they may not have been writing about real women, but imaginary women, or even the act of writing poetry as a girlfriend. In fact, the whole first book of Propertius' poetry was known as the Cynthia, even though not every poem was about her. This shows us that even ancient readers conflated his poetry with his girlfriend. So first up is Catullus, who was born in 85 BCE. He wrote during the late Republic and was the lead poet of the Neoterics. Neoterics were avant-garde poets. Instead of writing long epic poems on historic and mythological subjects, which was the norm up until this time, they wrote short little poems about daily life that they called nugae, or nuggets. Within his poetry, so as I talked about already, in his poetry, Lesbia is his girlfriend, but Lesbia is not the only woman he talks about. He mentions at least 3 other women as his lovers, as well as a young boy named Juventius. This is probably also a pseudonym since it roughly translates to young boy. In addition to poems about his love affairs, Catullus also writes a lot of sexually explicit invective. Invective is basically call-out poetry towards one's rivals, enemies, etc. Catullus' goal in using sexuality to personally attack his enemies is to cast himself as more masculine than them, and them as effeminate weaklings. We'll see a mix of both of these types in the poetry selections for this class. And so let's begin with the Sparrow poems. These are poems 2, 2b, which I left out 2b, and poem 3, which I gave the first half of. So Sparrow, my girl's, here's poem 2. Sparrow, my girl's darling, whom she plays with, whom she cuddles, whom she likes to tempt with her fingertip and teases to nip harder, when my own bright-eyed desire fancies some endearing fun and a small solace for her pain. I suppose so heavy a passion then rests. Would I could play with you as she does and lighten the spirit's gloomy cares. The story about the sparrow continues in poem 3. Grieve, O Venuses and loves, and all the lovelier people that there are. My girl's sparrow is dead. Sparrow, my girl's darling, whom she loved more than her eyes. For honey sweet he was, and knew his mistress well, as a girl her mother. Nor would he ever leave her lap, but hopping around this way, that way, kept cheeping for his lady alone. While these poems aren't the most sexually, aren't the first ones in the collection, they are so close to the beginning that they set the tone. These seem pretty tame for love poems, but that's just at first glance. Why would Catullus write 2 poems about his girlfriend's pet bird? The actions of the bird have led scholars to come up with a different interpretation. The sparrow is played with and cuddled and tempted and teased. It spent the majority of its time in the girl's lap and would cheep and leap for her alone. If you're thinking and have a dirty mind, yes, scholars have a theory that the sparrow is not a sparrow, but a symbol for Catullus' penis. But how can a penis die, you may ask? Your book gives you the answer. Impotence. His penis is dead because he can't get it up. Moving on to our first explicit mentions of lesbia, we have what are known as the kiss poems, Catullus 5 and 7. Catullus 5 reads, "We should live, my lesbia, and love, and value all the talk of stricter old men at a single penny." And then at the end, we get to the kisses. "Give me 1,000 kisses, then 100, then another 1,000, then a second 100, then still another 1,000, and then a second 100. And then we've made many thousands. We'll muddle them so as not to know, or lest some villain overlook us, knowing the total of our kisses." The story of these kisses continue in poem 7, in which he says, "You ask how many of your mega kisses would more than satisfy me, lesbia. Great is the sum of Libycian sand lying in sulphureous Cyrene from the oracle of torrid Jove to old Bacchus's holy sepulchre, or many as the stars when night is silent that watch the stolen loves of humans. To kiss you just so many kisses would more than satisfy mad Catullus. The inquisitive couldn't count them all, nor evil tongue bring them bad luck." These poems are very interesting because they seem to be inverting traditional views about male and female sexuality. As I mentioned earlier, women were thought of as being unable to control their sexual desire, but in these poems, Catullus depicts himself as lacking self-control, not lesbia. The lines, "Value all the talk of stricter old men at a single penny," tell us that this behavior on Catullus's part was not socially accepted. He's getting talked about, and yet he doesn't care. Moving on to Catullus 51, which is in the same vein. It reads, "That man is seen by me as God's equal, or if it may be said, the God's superior, who sitting opposite again and again watches and hears you, sweetly laughing, which dispossesses poor me of all my senses. For no sooner, lesbia, do I look at you than there's no power left in me of speech in my mouth, but my tongue's paralyzed. Invisible flame courses down through my limbs with din of their own. My ears are ringing, and twin darkness covers the light of my eyes. Leisure, Catullus, does not agree with you. At leisure you're restless, too excitable. Leisure in the past has ruined rulers and prosperous cities." This poem continues the depiction of Catullus being unable to control himself. He literally loses control of his body when he sees his girl talking with another man. There's also some interesting gender subversion in this poem, as it is actually a translation of a Greek poem written by the poetess Sappho. So Catullus is deliberately writing himself into the female role here. Catullus's poetry is a perfect example of literary evidence that is difficult to interpret. And while it is possible to use it as evidence for Roman sexual norms, Catullus himself is proof that there were some Romans who liked to either spoof on these norms or even like to outrageously embrace a gender or sexual persona that would be considered deviant by stodgy old Romans. And now moving on to one of the more infamous poems, Catullus 16. Let's read it. "I'll bugger you and stuff your gobs, Aurelius kink and poofter furious, for thinking me, because my verses are rather sissy, not quite decent. For the true poet should be chaste himself, his verses need not be. Indeed, they've salt and charm, then only when rather sissy and not quite decent, and when they can excite an itch, I don't say in boys, but in those hairy victims of lumbar sclerosis. Because you've read my X thousand kisses, you doubt my virility? I'll bugger you and stuff your gobs." This poem is why I did that brief overview of how your book translates explicit words. The more accurate translation of the first two lines of the poem would be, "I will butt fuck you, then face funk you, kinky, Aurelius, and effeminate furious." In this poem, Catullus acknowledges that others accuse him of lacking masculinity because of his obsessive kiss poems. This is evidenced in the line, "Because you've read of my X thousand kisses, you doubt my virility," which perhaps refers back to poems 5 and 7. Thus, this poem is a defense against his critics. He argues that his life is different from his poetry and proves it by threatening to orally and anally rape his critics, an act of uber-masculine behavior. He also defends his erotic poetry as being the only good type of poetry that there is. This suggests that Catullus relishes in taking a non-conventional masculine persona in his poetry, even feminine, as we have seen with poem 51, while he attacks other Roman men for their own failures of masculinity. Next, let's talk about Propertius. The dates for Propertius are very uncertain, but he was definitely Augustan because his patron was Maecenas. but not for the poems that you're reading. These poems, which are from his first book of poetry, which was, as I mentioned before, called the Cynthia, got Maecenas' attention, and he joined the circle of Maecenas for books 2 through 4 of his poetry. His previous patron was also Ovid's patron, so they were close friends, and scholars often compare their poetry. And when compared to Ovid, Propertius seems gloomy and obscure, especially since death is a frequent theme. He also is witty, but often uses this wit against himself, as in 116, where Adore complains about Propertius, the closed-out lover, singing songs outside all night. And we'll look at this briefly. Not every poem is about his love of Cynthia. Interspersed are poems about prominent political themes, often criticizing the wars that Augustus had recently waged. And finally, the lifestyle that he portrays himself as leading, in subjection to a mistress and making no contribution to the welfare of the state, is a clear affront to the Augustan restoration and morals. And so let's read some Propertius. Let's start the way Propertius did, with Cynthia. Cynthia first, with her eyes, caught wretched me, smitten before by no desires. Then lowering my stare of steady arrogance, with feet imposed, loved pressed my head, until he taught me hatred of chaste girls, the villain, and living aimlessly. And now for a whole year this mania has not left me, though I'm forced to suffer adverse gods. Skipping to the end, he says, stay home, all of you to whom the god nods with easy ear, and be paired in love forever true. On me our Venus levies nights of bitterness, and empty love is ever present. I warn you, shun this evil. Let each man's darling hold him, nor quit when love has grown familiar. But if to warnings anyone should turn a slow ear, alas, how bitterly he'll rue my words. Propertius begins his book of poetry by showing exactly how much control Cynthia has over his life. He is powerless to resist her. This is very similar to the subservient position we saw Catullus taking to Lesbia. He ends the poem by asking others to take him as an example of what not to do in a love affair. You don't let your woman control you. Thus he begins his entire book of poetry by painting a picture of himself as a pathetic, woman-controlled man, the opposite of what he should be. Finally, the line, until he taught me hatred of chaste girls, tells us that Cynthia is not an upper-class Roman woman or his wife, but a high-class courtesan, a mistress. Their torrid love affair continues in Propertius 1:3, lines 27 through 45, which I've excerpted here. Whenever rarely moving, this poem starts with Propertius coming home from a party, drunk, and finding Cynthia asleep, and he's just so in love with her, he compares her to all these beautiful mythological women, and then states, whenever, rarely moving, you drew a sigh, I froze in superstitious dread, that dreams were bringing you strange fears, and some man forced you to be his. Until the moon, passing the window opposite, the busy moon with lingering light, opened those calm, closed eyes with weightless beams. So, and she dug an elbow into the couch, at last, humiliation brings you back to our bed, thrown out from another woman's door. Where have you wasted the long hours of my night? Limp, alas, now the stars are set. Villain, oh how I wish you could endure such nights, as you always inflict on wretched me. Sometimes I cheated sleep with crimson thread, or a tired tune on Orpheus's lyre. Or I whispered complaints to my forsaken self at unmarried love's long absences, until I dropped off, stroked by slumber's welcome wings. That thought, above all, made me weep. This poem is a good example of the double expectations in Roman culture for men versus women. Propertius comes home drunk from a party and watches Cynthia sleeping while worrying that she has been unfaithful, when he had been off probably being unfaithful to her with a prostitute at the party. She accosts him for being with another woman, coming home to her unable to sexually sate her, limp, and then explains that she has been faithful to him all night, the way a wife would be, and they are unmarried. Now let's look at Propertius 1:16, which I already mentioned, which is written from the point of view of a door that Propertius is standing outside of singing to, presumably Cynthia's door. It starts, what's more, I'm forced to weep and wail in sympathy, with a suppliant's long nights of watching. He never gives my doorposts any peace, singing over and over this whining serenade. And then he gives Propertius's song, which I have excerpted here, and ends with this and much else typical of wretched lovers, he tries to drown the bird's dawn's chorus. So now, for a lady's fault and a lover's endless weeping, I'm the lasting butt of malicious gossip. I've already mentioned this poem, but let's look at it more closely. This was a type of poem that was very common in Latin love elegy, the paraclausitharon, or the song sung outside of the shut door of a lover's house. Propertius twists the trope, though, and instead of writing the song he would sing outside of his lover's door, he depicts the door complaining about his song. The door complains that he was once venerable, but is now the residence of a woman of questionable character, and that this happens all the time. What we get out of this poem is another example of the pathetic image of himself that Propertius creates. And last but not least, we have Ovid. There's no need to introduce him, as we've read a lot of his metamorphoses already. But it does bear mentioning that Ovid is very witty and tongue-in-cheek when it comes to his love poetry, even more blatantly so than Propertius. In fact, very few scholars see any serious intent in Ovid's handling of the themes and conventions of love elegy. His wit is obvious and sustained, often coming close to parody of the genre. Moreover, he writes with great clarity. We are never in doubt about his thought process or the dramatic situation, and his allusions to mythology are very rarely obscure. In the 5th century, Sidonius Apollinaris asserted that Ovid's mistress, Corinna, was actually no less a personage than Augustus's daughter, Julia, though not many scholars actually believe this. In fact, if we look for a Roman equivalent to Corinna, the name, which is cognate with the Greek word for girl, chore, the obvious word having the same prosody is puella, meaning simply and quite uninformatively girl. If the pseudonym Corinna does not disguise the identity of a particular real woman, it seems reasonable to conclude that Ovid's amores are not based on an affair with an actual woman. Ovid's useless and indignant protest to Cupid in the beginning of 1:1, which we'll see shortly, set the tone for the amores. Very little goes right for him as he recounts his amatory adventures. A successful and happy love affair would have offered little sustained dramatic interest. Obstacles to love provide more fertile themes for a poet wishing to draw out the comic possibilities of the genre. Hence, Ovid is constantly plagued by his mistress's absence or reluctance, by rivals, by husbands, by chaperones, by procuresses, by doorkeepers, and by rivers in flood. Whatever happens to him, he presents himself as losing out. And so he begins this book of poetry with, I meant in solemn meter to rehearse a tale of arms and war and violence, matching the weighty manner with my verse. All lines alike in length, no difference. But Cupid laughed, they say, and filched 1 foot away. No boy, no girl with long and lovely hair, I'd made my protest. He drew instantly an arrow from his quiver, chosen with care to lay me low, and braced against his knee his crescent bow. Here, poet, take this for the verses you need to make. Poor me, that boy's sure arrows never stray. I'm burning, in my vacant breast love reigns. So in 6 beats my verse must rise today and settle back in 5. Farewell, you strains of stately war, farewell to you in your epic meter. The absence of sincere emotion from the amores is made clear immediately. The first poem is hardly about love at all. Ovid tells us that he was writing a war epic in the conventional meter of hexameters, but then Cupid stole a foot from the second line, turning it into a pentameter, so he was left with elegiac couplets, the meter for love poetry. He protests at length that Cupid should mind his own business and not interfere in poetry, which is in Apollo's sphere of influence. He ends by saying that he cannot write love poetry because he's not in love. This is a tactical error, for Cupid invalidates this objection very simply by shooting him and thus making him fall in love. Moving on to Amores 1:3, lines 21 to 32, Ovid talks about how faithful of a lover he would be. He says, I'm not love's acrobat to leap from bed to bed. Believe me, you'll be mine always. With you may heaven let me pass my days through the span granted by the sister's thread, and die with you there weeping. Offer me yourself, a happy subject for my verse. My verse will issue worthy of its source. So many owe their fame to poetry. We too shall live in verse the whole world through, and my name shall ever be linked with you. The superficiality of Ovid's love poetry continues in this poem, where he tells his unnamed girl that he will make them both famous for their love affair, but she's unnamed, so how can she be famous? This suggests that Ovid's intent in writing these poems is not to document a love affair, but to gain the same type of fame that Propertius and Catullus got for writing about their love affairs. Finally, Ovid 1:9, where we get the lovers are soldiers trope. So the first 4 lines read, lovers are soldiers, Atticus, believe me, lovers are soldiers. Cupid has his core. The age that's fit for fighting finds for Venus. Old men are shamed in loving, shamed in war. And then continues later, lines 21 through 28. It often pays to catch the enemy sleeping, and rank and file unarmed with arms to slay. Thus fell the fierce brigade of Thracian Rhesus. The captured horses left their lord that day. And likewise lovers use a husband's slumber to launch their weapons on a sleeping foe. Soldier and wretched lover, it's their business to foil the watch and past the centuries go. Here Ovid compares lovers to soldiers in this famous elegy addressed to his friend Atticus, for both must be young and in good physical condition. Famous fighters like Achilles, Hector, and Agamemnon were also lovers, but Ovid only enlists in love's warfare. We saw poems like this before in our lecture about military. This is Ovid's take on the recusatio, the I'm not going to write a war poem. Ovid argues he's already at war. He's a soldier in the army of love. While similar to the others we read in our lecture about the military, Ovid is a bit more cheeky. Given his cheeky demeanor and the fact he is probably not writing about a real love affair, he's advocating for writing poetry instead of falling in love. So this past summer, like just a few months ago, a biographical movie about Ovid came out called Ovid and the Art of Love. It is biographical in that it tells about Ovid's life, but the characters from ancient Rome are transported to downtown Detroit. Here is Amores 1:9 as interpreted by the movie.
All lovers are soldiers. Believe me, even Cupid has his own camp. Both lover and soldier keep watch all night. Those qualities which generals look for in a brave soldier, a beautiful girl seeks too. And let your mistress come and go as she pleases. Husbands let this happen with their wives. With soft slumber, add to the intrigue.